I'm Warren Miltier, an associate professor at George Washington University, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of researching free people of color in Virginia. So free people of color are mentioned in the larger exhibit. Abraham Skipwith, who was a part of the exhibit, was a free person of color. And so what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about my project that I'm working on free people of color. I've got a book coming out on this topic next year. I want to tell you a little bit about the book, but mostly about the process of researching free people of color, how you can find out information about these people, and some of this information may be relevant to other populations beyond free people of color. So before we get into a lot of detail, I just wanted to talk about this category, free people of color. I don't know how many people are familiar with this terminology. To give you a brief idea of what this is a category that was used during the period of slavery for people of color who were free, and these could be people of African descent or Native American descent. Some of these people were born free. Other people were manumitted, which was a legal process in which an enslaved person would become free. There are some free people of color in Virginia who had been free since the colonial days, others who obtained their freedom later in the late 18th century and early 19th century in particular. Those are important points for the growth of population of free people of color. I did have a couple of examples of more contemporary explanations of what free people of color are. So this one comes from a man named William Valentine. He lived actually in Hertford County, North Carolina, which is on the border with Virginia. I guess you would say the northeastern part of North Carolina. So this is the definition he offered of free people of color. It's kind of convoluted, but sort of fits with what I just told you as far as how people became free, and also the mix of people who could be categorized as people of color. Yeah, I see, okay. So it says, free Negroes are slaves and their descendants emancipated by Quakers and other benevolent whites, once owners of them. The mulatto is the offspring between the white and the Negro, or between the Indian and the Negro, or between the white and the Indian. And then this is a slightly more simple definition of free people of color from the 1850s, offered by the Supreme Court of North Carolina, who dealt with a case in which they needed to define this terminology, and so that's why we have this information. And it says, free persons of color may be, then for all we can see, persons colored by Indian blood or persons descended from Negro ancestors beyond the 4th degree. So in this time period, they think they can like measure out blood quantums and things of that nature. So anybody who would have been below that would technically be a white person. So you could have African ancestry or Native American ancestry and still be considered white in this time period. This is before we get the idea of the one-drop rule. Now, how this actually operated in real life is a little bit more messy. So then I wanted to just talk a little bit about how I got interested in this research on free people of color. The simple answer is I'm a descendant of free people of color. I started researching my family back when I was a kid, and that research eventually led me into more in-depth research about people beyond my family, and I started working on this topic in a more serious way while I was still an undergraduate in college, and then moved on to grad school and continued working on this topic. And since then, I've published 3 books, and I've got 2 more coming out, all about free people of color. Most of them focus on the South, but I'm also now doing research a little bit further north. All right, so this is the book, Freedom in the Age of Slavery: A History of Free People of Color in Virginia, which will be out supposedly in May. Hopefully that stays. I mean, I've written it, so it does exist. There's real text that goes along with this. I've done my part. And so what topics do I cover in this book? Here's the chapter outline. I can kind of give you a brief explanation. So we've got 5 chapters. They're covering different time periods. The early chapter talks about the colonial period. Then I go into the era of the American Revolution, late 1700s, and talk about the experiences of free people of color during the Revolution, but also the expansion and emancipations and manumissions during that time period. So there is a loosening of the laws, which I can talk a little bit more about later, around the practice of manumission, which will allow more enslaved people to become free during that time. Then the third chapter and the fourth chapter cover the, let's say, the early part and middle to early part of the 19th century and the experiences of free people of color during that time period. A lot of the material that I cover in that area, in that particular era of time, also deals with the law and the changes in the law that applied to free people of color. And then the final chapter deals with the experiences of free people of color in the Civil War and Reconstruction, which is a particularly interesting time to explore the lives of free people of color. And I think to some extent connects to some of the points that were brought up in the earlier presentation, especially when we're asking questions about property ownership and who had influence after the Civil War. Just I guess a tidbit of information on that. There's definitely an overrepresentation of free people of color in the post-war time period when we're thinking about property ownership and political power. And I would probably argue that still exists today in some way, shape, or form. It'd be a little bit harder to research, but some of the first black people in different areas of politics in Virginia definitely are descendants of free people of color. All right, so I wanted to now get into the research side of this project. How do you research free people of color? Where do you find free people of color? So we're lucky to some extent with the population of free people of color that they're fairly well documented in a variety of different records. Many of those records are stored here at the Library of Virginia. I would say this is probably the location where you're going to find more records about free people of color in Virginia than anywhere else. So the first group of records I wanted to talk about are court records, county court records. There are also city records, like in the city of Richmond and the city of Petersburg operated separately from the surrounding counties at different points in history, and so they would have their own sets of records. The county court records are scattered across the state. Many of them are located here. Others are still held by the counties or the cities, and they vary from deeds and wills to court records related to criminal cases, civil cases, all the way to some specialized records that we don't usually see anymore, such as apprenticeship records. There are also records specifically related to quote-unquote free Negroes. And some of those records are held here. Some of those would also be found in the local courts even today. So just to give you a little breakdown of some of the court records that you could find, because there's so many different types. One particularly useful set of records for researching free people of color are the court order books. So court order books are books that are basically giving notations about the regular activities of the courts. And so depending on what county you're looking at or which city you're looking at, some of these records go back into the 1600s. And of course, there's still order books of different sorts that are being produced about court activities. And so this particular image that you see here is a record book from the 1690s in Accomack County, which is on the eastern shore of Virginia. It's a little bit hard to read, I know. Here's a little bit of a close-up. This gives you an example of a couple of cases that you would find in these early order books. So some of the things that people were interested in policing back in the 1690s, of course, are different than what people are interested in policing, or at least the degree to which they're interested in policing them today. So the case that I wanted to bring your attention to is a case in the middle of the page about this woman named Elizabeth Driggers, and she's listed in the record as a mulatto. And basically, she has been called before the court to give the name of the man who fathered her child who was born out of wedlock. And so this record gives this man's name. She names this man named John Pash. And so this record is interesting for me as somebody studying free people of color, but it also could be interesting for somebody who's looking for the family history, right? Because here you have the potential mother and father of your ancestor, and there are records like this for free people of color and all other people as well, including occasionally you will see enslaved men mentioned in these types of records. If the woman is free and the father of her child is an enslaved man, he would still be mentioned. If the woman is enslaved, you probably would not find such a record. All right, so another type of court record that I've come across and have found particularly useful in the research about free people of color are apprenticeship records. So apprenticeship is practiced in the colonial period and the early 19th century, in particular in Virginia and many other states and colonies. And so basically what they're doing is they're taking children away from their parents and placing them under the guardianship of a master. The idea is that person who's the master would train the apprentice in some type of trade, and what that trade looks like can vary quite a bit. Some people are being taught they're being taught skills that would not be very profitable in the end. So some people are just trained to be like a farmhand or something like that. Not to necessarily be a farmer and know the ins and outs of business, but just to be a farmhand. Or to be a servant. That is something you could be apprenticed out to somebody for. There are then also people who learn trade skills that do help them become successful, and they're able to buy property, things of that nature, based on the skills that they learn through apprenticeship. So it's a very mixed system that exists around apprenticeship in Virginia and many other places. But these records are very important because they tell us about these work conditions, but they also tell us important genealogical information about free people of color. So these are records where you can often find the names of parents of individuals. And so they have a lot of value, even though apprenticeship is not something that we hear about in this form today. Manumission records. So manumission records are records in which we see enslaved people obtaining their freedom. These records are scattered in a variety of different places and forms. Some of them appear, like this particular document, as just loose records. And so this document I found in Emporia in Greensville County, Virginia. And so there, they just have like a box of records. There are boxes here too with manumission records for different counties. A lot of manumission records also appear in deed books because enslaved people are property. And so the process of moving from being property to obtaining your freedom is often recorded in those records. Sometimes you would also see these records in the county order books or county minute books that I mentioned earlier. Then we have what are called free Negro registers. So these are really valuable records when it comes to studying free people of color. And while their purpose in their time was mixed in a sense that it was used both to keep a record of who was free in contrast to who was not, but also people who had free papers, which are associated with these registers, were able to use those papers to move around and prove their freedom, especially if they're leaving a place where they're not, going into a place where they're not known. And so what would happen is you would go to court, you would pay a fee, and you would have your description recorded in one of these books. And so every county was supposed to keep a book. Not all of those books have survived, and it seems like some counties may have actually put the information that's supposed to appear in these registers in the order books instead of in the free Negro registers. But these are really amazing records. Some states, other states have them, but Virginia's collection, I would say Maryland probably are the states that I've seen that have the best kept records of this type. I don't know how many of you all can see some of this, but basically they give a description of where a person was born, their height, their complexion, and often how they became free. So it might say so-and-so was manumitted by an individual. It might say so-and-so was born free. Sometimes these records will even give the names of parents. So again, very useful if you're interested in genealogical research. Petitions. So I used a lot of petitions in my research on free people of color. There are a variety of different places that you can find petitions. So free people of color are politically active in the sense that they will petition the government for things that they need. Sometimes that's a legal exemption. Sometimes it's an assertion of maybe they want a pension because they served in the war in some way and they need to get their benefits. People are petitioning at a certain point in Virginia to remain in the state of Virginia because there are laws that prevent manumitted people after a certain period of staying in Virginia legally. So that is something that you will see in these petitions. And so there are a variety of different types of petitions. Most of the petitions I've found in Virginia are here at the library or have been digitized by the library. So there are petitions that were sent to the state legislature. There were petitions that were sent to the governor. And sometimes there are petitions that are even submitted to local governments. And so you can find information about free people of color in those records. And what kind of information you can find varies quite a bit, from just the details of a particular case all the way through, something about a family. So like this particular petition was a woman who was trying to emancipate her husband, and she needed to get permission to keep her husband in Virginia. And so she goes through a little bit of detail about the process of trying to obtain her husband's freedom, which is really interesting, especially for somebody from this particular time period. All right, and so another type of record that's really essential to learning about free people of color, and I would say anybody who's living in the time period that I'm covering potentially, are pension records. So there are a variety of different pension records that exist about free people of color in Virginia and the larger population. So some pension records are held by the state of Virginia, and many of those you would find here or have been digitized by the library. Some of those would be related to the American Revolution, the Civil War. Then there are federal records, and so the federal government's records are mostly located in the National Archives. Again, some of those records have been digitized as well. And these pensions, would cover anything from the American Revolution, War of 1812, and we're thinking about free people of color, the Civil War. And so the records, as they get closer to time, tend to be more detailed and therefore potentially more useful. I found for the case of free people of color in particular that the Civil War records are extremely valuable because that's one place where you can see the words of free people of color. It's often very difficult to find their own words and the reflections of their own ideas and values and life experiences, and those are one place where you can see those. There are also records. This particular example is an American Revolutionary War pension, and those records are pretty good too, but generally not as detailed as those later records from the Civil War era. Church records. Church records I have found to be very interesting and valuable for multiple reasons. This particular image is from a minute from a Baptist organization in Virginia, and so these minute books were printed up every year that this organization had a meeting, and the minute books will list like who is the representative of each church sent to this particular organization. And then there's details about their conversations that they had. And so occasionally free people of color come up in these conversations. Slavery definitely comes up in conversations, especially as you get closer to the Civil War time period. Some of the early Baptist organizations actually had people of color who represented churches and were sent to these meetings. So you would have a mix of white people and people of color meeting together, talking about their church issues and things that they thought were necessary to come together to speak about. There are other church records that are specifically related to individual churches, and I found those to be very useful as well, because you could see some of the internal dynamics around the individual churches, and they often give membership lists so you can see who the different members were, and these books often are segregated, so you'll have a white section of the book and a colored section of the book, and it will give the names of all the members. Sometimes there's a lot of details about church discipline, especially in the Baptist church. And so you can see, how the churches operated and tried to negotiate conflicts within their congregations. And I found that there are a lot of people who show up in church records where you just won't find them anywhere else for this particular time period. I know from my book that's coming out, there's some counties here in Virginia where most of the court records are gone. They were burned up at some point in time, but the church records have been really useful for recovering the names of enslaved people and free people of color that you just wouldn't find otherwise. Newspapers. So newspapers are a mixed bag, but still important source. Depending on the place, depending on the time, you can find certain information about free people of color in these records. I would say a more common type of record would be the one that is right here, about this man, George Cook, who was a servant who had run away during the American Revolution, and his master thinks that he is probably joined the army and is trying to recover him or prevent him from joining the army if he hasn't. The second article comes originally from a Norfolk newspaper and is really interesting. It's a story of this woman named Sarah Cuffey and her descendants, and it discusses that she has 124 descendants, which is probably true, I think, based on what I've seen with the Cuffey family out of Norfolk, what was Norfolk County, now Chesapeake. There are a lot of Cuffeys even today in that area for anybody who's from that area. But those are some of the things you would find. Other things that might pop up in a newspaper might be like business ads. People are trying to recover property, including their free papers. So people will put out rewards for their free papers. If they lost a cow, they put that in there. They don't want to pay. One that's really unique that you'll see where men who don't want to pay their wives' bills because they're technically responsible for those things, and they're claim that their wife ran away or something and they don't want to pay the bill. You'll see free people of color put ads in the newspaper for that. Schools, occasionally you'll see burial societies, things like that. All right, so those are the sources, and if you have questions about sources, we can talk about that a little bit more later. So I just wanted to talk briefly about how many free people of color are we talking about here, all right? Does anybody have any guesses? 10%? You're thinking about like of the overall population of people of color? Okay. Yeah. 1%? Okay. Well, I'll give you just total numbers instead of us thinking about this in percentages. So around 1790, that's the first time we have a federal census. There are about 12,000 to 13,000 free people of color in Virginia. And so that doesn't sound like a lot of people, but that's actually the largest population of free people of color in the United States at the time. By 1860, so the eve of the Civil War, that population has grown to 58,000 free people of color, which places Virginia second, with the second largest population of free people of color, only surpassed by Maryland. So It's interesting to think about Virginia. Virginia is the state with the largest population of enslaved people, but also one of the states with the largest populations of free people of color. And we're talking about the whole country. So all the northern states, the southern states, Virginia is always at the top of the list of free people of color.
Excuse me, during this time period, what is the total population of Virginia?
I'd have to look at that. I don't have that off the top of my head. As far as location of free people of color and where they were situated in the state. So this is Virginia, 1861. So many of you all probably know that Virginia and West Virginia of today were the same state at that particular time. They were one state. And so the vast majority of free people of color are situated in the eastern part of Virginia, and I would say eastern part of what was Virginia then, but also even what we would consider Virginia now. So places that had large populations would have been places like Richmond, Petersburg, Surry County, Norfolk County, which is now Chesapeake, Nansemond County, which is now Suffolk. Around Alexandria, you had a pretty sizable population of free people of color. Accomack County on the eastern shore had a large population of free people of color. In the southern part of the state, Mecklenburg, Southampton, places of that nature had large populations of free people of color. Some of these counties with large populations seem to have also had significant populations of Quakers, and Quakers were involved in emancipating large numbers of free people of color, along with other religious organizations, but the Quakers in particular. And so, for instance, like Southampton County had a very strong and influential group of Quakers at this time, Nansemond County as well. All right, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about one particular theme of my research in learning about free people of color, and that's the class divide amongst free people of color and the varied experiences that were brought about by that class divide. So you have some free people of color who are struggling through most of this time period in which I'm talking about. They're poor, they don't have a lot of property or any property of significance at all. Like I said, some of these people are apprentices or people who are working as servants. And that's going in the colonial period as well as in the post-colonial period, the early to mid-19th century. And so in my work, I discuss a few examples. So one example is this man, Thomas Greenwich. He was a servant, and this is a advertisement from a newspaper seeking his recovery. And so his master's giving details about what he looked like and what he was wearing. That's pretty typical of what you would see. This particular man is listed as being an East India Indian, which means he's actually a person from Asia. So you do have a few free people of color who have some Asian background as well. That's not well known, but it is the reality. So he would be, I guess, your example, somebody kind of at the bottom of the economic scale as far as free people of color is concerned. On the other side of that would be the Brown family, who I discussed in my book. The Brown family were from Charles City County. There was a pretty well-to-do population of free people of color in Charles City County in the late 1700s, in the early 19th century, and I mean, some of them are still doing pretty well, I think. And so the images you see are from the Elam Baptist Church Cemetery out in Charles City County. And the Brown family, during the late 18th century, early 19th century, were owners of hundreds of acres of land. There were a few of them were actually slaveholders. So they're definitely on the other side of this economic situation compared to the previous example. And then I would say maybe somewhere in between these two are Agnes and Elizabeth Langley. They have a really interesting story. So this is their burial plot in Lynchburg. Agnes and Elizabeth were originally enslaved and obtained their freedom. Exactly why and how they obtained their freedom is a little bit murky. I mean, there's a deed, but the deed doesn't give the whole story. And anyways, they leave Lunenburg County, Virginia, or is it Charlotte? One of the two, one of those counties, and they ended up going to Lynchburg, and they set up a business there. Now, their business would be, considered a little shady today. They were prostitutes. They ran a house of prostitution in Lynchburg, but apparently they were very successful in that business and were able. I mean, yeah, they really were. Like, for the time, they came off quite well. And if you go to the cemetery and see this burial plot, like it stands out. And, there's some other issues about race and how these people were viewed in that time we could talk about later. But anyways, yeah, I would say they're kind of in the middle. So they're not major property holders in the sense that they own hundreds of acres of land and things of that nature, but they own some city lots. They're able to apparently, decorate their houses really well. They own a lot of personal property according to the census records. So, there's still, opportunities for success in a variety of different ways in Virginia for free people of color, despite some of the limitations. And so let's talk about some of those limitations really quick. I want to talk about the legal status of free people of color. The easy thing, I guess you could say, is that over time, as far as the legal codes are concerned, the status of free people of color gradually declines. What that looks like in real life can vary quite a bit because some of the laws that are developed around the lives of free people of color are specific to like people who are being charged with crimes or people who are convicted of crimes. So for instance, by the time we get to the Civil War, Virginia's passed a law that permits county courts to enslave people who've been convicted of crimes. Most people never experience being enslaved because they're convicted of a crime, right? But it's out there, it's a threat potentially to those people who end up in court, right? Then you have other laws that pop up, say in the mid 19th century. So they don't apply through most of the time period in which I'm looking at. One of those would be a restriction on education. So there are several attempts to make it more difficult for free people of color to obtain any type of formal education, reading, writing skills through a school, right? So first, the state legislature tries to take away the right to attend schools in Virginia, and then when people try to send their children out of Virginia, they try to place even more restrictions on them and prevent that from happening, for example. So that's one restriction. Of course, there are other things that you might expect during this time period. So restrictions on voting, those actually originate in the colonial period, and in Virginia continue on until after the Civil War. And it's interesting because Virginia's neighboring states don't necessarily operate like this. So for instance, in North Carolina, free men of color could actually vote until the 1830s. In Maryland, they could vote into the early 1800s, whereas in Virginia, they couldn't, they lost the right to vote in the early 1700s. And to what degree they were voting at all is hard to trace. But yeah, in many ways, Virginia is a model for discrimination during this time. Even though you have this large population of free people of color here, and even though some of those people are at least economically doing okay. So I just wanted to share this particular example of a case related to the law. So this newspaper article talks about a free woman of color and several other free people of color and enslaved people who had gathered at her house for religious services. So in this time period, this was illegal. And the reason it was illegal, number one, there was not a white person present, so that would have been something that you needed to do. So if there's a church for people of color, be they enslaved, free, they're supposed to have like a white minister by this time period. This has not always been the case, but by the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, this is what's going on in Virginia. And so you see these types of restrictions on gathering, not just affecting, people who are gathering for parties or things, but something as simple as, trying to practice religion. All right, so I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you have, and thank you for your attention.
You showed some photographs throughout your presentation,
Yes.
and I wondered if you could tell us who these people are.
Oh, boy.
Like, who is he? And
Okay.
Langston
Yeah. So this guy, he was a free man of color from Nottoway County, I think, originally. He ended up migrating to Ohio and then later Michigan. Let me see. That one is kind of self-explanatory, I think. Yeah, that's John Mercer Langston. So John Mercer Langston is another person who was born in Virginia. He left Virginia and moved to Ohio. He actually obtained a college education in Ohio, became a lawyer, and then after the Civil War, he eventually made his way back to Virginia and ran for public office and became a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for Virginia. And there's a lot of scandal around his attempt to take office.
He wasn't connected with Virginia State University?
He was.
Yeah.
Yes, right. He was the president, right, yeah. He's a lot of things. Yeah, he's a minister he did a lot of stuff. And so, that's Joseph Jenkins Roberts. And so he was the first president of Liberia. So, there are a lot of free people of color doing big things, right? Yeah, and that's his wife. So she was the first lady of Liberia. Yeah.
So my question is, how was Agnes and Elizabeth viewed racially? And did this have impact on the type of clients that sought their services? And did this, impact the success of their business overall?
Well, I don't know who their clients were. I could have some guesses of who their clients were. Obviously, they weren't poor people, right? If they ended up doing pretty well financially. So I'm trying to remember if it's Agnes or Elizabeth or both. So they appear in Lynchburg's Free Negro Register, right? So there's descriptions of them. I think it was Elizabeth who had made some claim about there was this law that was passed in the 1830s that was basically like an escape hatch to some of these discriminatory laws. Often it's described as not a Negro law. So you could go before a court and have yourself classified. Basically, you're still a free person of color, but you're not a Negro. So therefore, any laws that apply specifically to Negroes don't apply to you. And so she was able to obtain, I think she was able to obtain a certificate for this. So it kind of put her in this middle ground in a sense. So these are definitely people very fair, maybe even white passing people. Yeah.
Hi, a quick comment and a couple of questions, and you touched on one of them. I did a quick Google search.
Yeah.
And again, it's Google, but it showed that in 1861, the population of Virginia was approximately 1.6 million people.
Right.
I don't remember all your numbers, but the free people of color would have had a low percentage, under 10%.
Right.
Now to my questions. One is, could you talk a little bit about incidences of passing for white? I grew up in Louisiana, so that's something that we are aware of. And also, could you talk about the various relationships between the free people of color who had a bit more money, the free people of color who were poor, and the slaves, how they interacted with each other?
Right. So the interactions question is complicated because there's limited evidence to, explain exactly what people thought at that time about each other. But there's definitely enough I think, circumstantial evidence, especially after the Civil War, to suggest that like some free people of color definitely saw themselves as distinct. There are others who I don't think thought that way, and I think some of that has to do with the origins of some of these free people of color, right? So you have some free people of color who have very close ties to the enslaved population. They might be emancipated people. Some of their family members might be enslaved, right? And so some of those individuals, not all of them, but some of those individuals might just have a much closer relationship with the enslaved population in general. And then, yeah, you definitely have others who, if they're property holders, if they maybe even own other people, are going to have a different type of relationship to the enslaved population, right? Their lives are very different. To some extent, there may be some benefit of keeping some separation, and the law also encourages separation. So that's what I could say about that. And as far as the passing thing is concerned, during the time period, I guess what we would call passing is something that's always happening, right? So there are people who are moving from being people of color to being white people in the colonial period in the 19th century, and you could say even today, right? There are people who are still making those moves. And so, I think one big question that's out there, I don't know how we would ever quantify this, is how many white people are actually descendants of free people of color? I would say it's a lot. I mean, in some communities, we're probably talking about half of the, descendants of the population of free people of color actually living as white people today. I mean, I know that in my own family, right? And that's something that nobody likes to talk about. And some people who are finding this out now with, DNA testing and just genealogy being more common, they're reacting in different ways. I've had people who've been very, hostile about this and don't want to talk about it at all. And there are other people who are very open to talking about this history. So, yeah, that's what I can say about that.
So I can give you some examples with interactions. So down in Norfolk, so we have the Lou Vest family that she was born as a free black. Her father is from Haiti. Her mother is from York County. She actually was a businesswoman that actually had her own restaurant, but she also owned a slave, Mark DeMorty, who, when he reached his 21st birthday, she freed him. And that her husband was actually Navy, but then also, that Mark also helped with the Underground Railroad when he started at 18. So I think with her, it's an example of she's supporting, she's owning an enslaved, but also she's kind of helping with the Underground Railroad. Now, similar woman like literally a block or two away from her, Louisa Apperson, was born a slave, sold by Bernard Rowe to her father, who was from Haiti, was freed by her father, but when she went to get her papers, her mother sued to get her papers, and it looked like there was a lot of angst about that. But then Louisa marries one of our big slave traders, Apperson, who then moves up here and basically lives the high life in a sense with the money. And so and speaking of like Mary Levesque, that when she went to get registered, she pointed out that, hey, I may be colored, but I am not a black woman. And that's mentioned in the order books. So yeah, there is that difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have two questions.
another one.
The newspaper article, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Of George Cook,
Yeah.
what year was that published? And then, the other thing I have a question is, the wealthy or free blacks, the ones that were able to own property, like in the counties,
Hmm.
were they able to buy slaves?
Okay.
I would like for you to address that.
Right. I think for the first question, I'm thinking like late 1770s for that. For some reason, 78 is coming to my mind, but don't quote me on that, but definitely late 1770s. For the second question, so depends on the time period, because this is one of the issues that the state legislature takes up. They're trying to, over time, restrict free people of color from purchasing enslaved people. So earlier on, yeah, there's opportunity for somebody, who's a free person of color to obtain slaves, and there's a lot of flexibility there. But by the time you get to the Civil War, there's more restrictions, and basically the idea is to restrict free people to buying only their family members, immediate family members, but nobody else beyond that.
Good morning. You gave the statistic of, I guess, 58,000 free people of color, and that being second to Maryland. What year was that?
1860.
Okay, and then as it relates to the discriminatory laws that existed at that time, are you aware of, does your research point you to, or is there a resource that ties laws that exist today to, I guess, what the precursor was, like, at that time? Is there something that you found, like, that has a direct tie or makes it easy to say, well, these assembly laws now relate back to that assembly law, as an example?
Right. I mean, the thing that kind of jumps to mind, and you could say it really goes back even further than this, would be like prison labor and using people who've been arrested for crimes and kind of manipulating that system. It's definitely something you see around free people of color, even before it appears in the post-Civil War period with chain gangs and things of that nature. A lot of that has a predecessor in this period. But of course, hiring out people, something was going on in England before the colonies were even formed. And so to some degree, what you see is some of these like really terrible laws that come out of England eventually becoming racialized in a sense as time goes on here in the United States.
I have a question. When a black American gets a DNA test, does it show like the Africa? Does it show a country? Does it show a tribe? How granular does it get? And does it show like if a white, like for my DNA test, it shows me like a migration basically out of Africa and across Europe and actually into Massachusetts and across New England. And so I can track things pretty accurately. Is a black person's DNA test similar?
Yeah, I mean, the companies are definitely offering those types of results. Now, we could have another discussion, which we're not going to have here, about, the legitimacy of some of those claims that come out on those DNA tests. But yeah.
Do you have any recommendations on how you find out more information about the census takers and their practices? Doing my own
Yeah.
genealogy, they were using mulatto and 18 blah and changed it back to black. And so, yeah, did they have any standards or ways they were supposed to do it in writing, and how can you find out?
Yeah, I think there are some actual standards. But, the thing with these racial classifications is that that's not how it was actually done in practice. A lot of this, it really does vary from person to person. Some of the logic makes no sense at all, right? So I've seen individuals, like pictures of people who appear in census records as black, even when you have this term mulatto as a choice, right? I'm like, this person looks like a white person. How did this person end up being categorized as black? So, this is race, right? Race doesn't make any sense anyways. It's a crazy idea that just, people use for their purposes. And we have to deal with the legacy of that concept, right? And the way it keeps changing over time. But yeah, I wouldn't think too hard about it in a sense, look at it, document, but yeah, do they actually have a formula that, oh, this person's 1/4 this or 1/8 this? No, not in practice. Yeah.
Can you throw, we have to wait till the book comes out.
Uh-huh.
But
Uh-huh.
could you throw out some names of some families from the central Virginia area, like the Jarretts and the Maddens, the Willits?
Yeah, I know. I discussed the Maddens. Yeah, you mentioned the Jarretts. I'm trying to remember. I know about them. I can't remember if I actually mentioned them in the book or not. Colson. Yeah, I think so. Briefly. Yeah.
Is that all in the book?
Some of it. Yeah. Some of it. Yeah. I can't cover everybody in great detail, but yeah.
So my question is, where do we kind of locate apprenticeship records? Does it require that we know exact business names and to look under the specific businesses themselves, or are those kept somewhere specific, like general?
So here at the Library of Virginia, there are actual, like a particular group of records that are called apprentice records. And so you would look them up by county generally, or the city. And you can find, go through those records and find some people. Now, often those records, as far as like the actual documents are concerned, are not complete. And so there may be references to apprenticeships in court order minutes that do not exist as loose document records. But those document records may have more details when they do exist.
Yeah, the free black population in Richmond, and even more so in Petersburg, was fairly large compared to the black populations. In either of those, were those free folks organized in any way together, or were they just more operating as individuals?
So I think, here's the thing. The answer is yes, they are organized to some degree. The details of that organization are harder to find. Not impossible, but harder to find. So, for instance, we know more about like church activity, right? Church activity is pretty well documented both for Petersburg and Richmond. There are records here at the Library of Virginia for some of the early churches that people of color operated in those cities. And so you can get a sense of some of the social interactions, some of, the people, get an idea who was in leadership during that time in those communities. So that's definitely a thing. And newspapers occasionally mention certain organizations in both cities. So yeah, there's something, not as much as I would like to see, but yeah, something.
Thank you.
At some point, Virginia enacted a law that an enslaved person who was freed had a year to leave the state.
Right.
When was that law enacted, and how strictly was it enforced?
So the first iteration, well, technically the first iteration is in the colonial period. Then that law is overturned in the Revolutionary period, and then there's a different version of that law, the one that I think you're specifically talking about, that comes about in the early 1800s. And then there are other variations of it that kind of changes as far as some of the parameters, what courts can give exceptions, things of that nature, or even allowing exceptions. So enforcement, it's a mixed bag. It seems that there are some people who are manumitted and are able to kind of just stay around without a lot of trouble. Other people are harassed. Some people clearly, they get they get their manumission papers, and they get the heck out as soon as they can. It does seem that probably by the time we get to the 1850s, some places are being a little bit more strict about these laws and the enforcement of them, but yeah, it's a mix.
Okay.
What about your other books? Can you talk about them?
Oh boy. I could tell you what they are. So I wrote a book about free people of color in Hertford County, North Carolina, which is on the Virginia border. I did a study on free people of color in North Carolina, the larger state. One about free people of color in the South, which I think is mentioned on the program. And then there's this book, and then there's another book coming out at around the same time as the Virginia book about free people of color during the Civil War era, and that book actually covers the North and the South and the experiences of free people of color in both sections of the country during that time.
And we have time for one more question.
Thank you. In your experience in tracing your ancestors back, did you find it easier because you traced back to free people and there were more records? And did you also find out how your ancestors were determined to be free people? Were they slaves originally, or were they always free people?
Right. So yeah, I think generally speaking, they're a little bit easier to trace because they were free. The only problem I've run into is that many of the counties where my relatives came from, the records were burned. And so I don't have the benefits that, say, somebody whose family comes from a place where the records are in good condition would have. But even with that, yeah, there's still some benefits. Like, for instance, I have an ancestor who served the American Revolution, so I've got a pension where he tells about his experience. Like, that's not something that you would necessarily find for somebody who was enslaved and remained enslaved in that same time period, right? And then, what was the second part of the question again? Oh, right, yeah. So I've not been able to locate any of my free ancestors who were manumitted. I suspect some of them were in certain branches of my family, but then there are other branches that they seem to have been free in the early colonial period. And, how exactly that happened is a little bit mysterious. You can't always answer these questions, but yeah. Yeah, those burned records are a problem. I'm telling you, some of it you just can't, unless somebody's got something in their attic. And if you do, let me know. All right, I guess we'll stop there. Thank you all.